everyone, and welcome to another episode of From the Lighthouse. I don't have Michelle here today, but I do have Jimmy. Hi, Jimmy.
Hi, Stephanie.
We also have Kirstin joining us from the other side of the world. Hi, Kirstin.
Hello.
So, Dr Kirstin Mills is a Victorian fantasy specialist. And for our purposes here today, she's a big horror fan. And then that's useful for us because it's nearly Halloween, and we thought we'd talk about some spooky texts today. And I can't say spooky without saying spooky. When I sent around the invitation, I think I put like 15 O's in it.
Yeah.
So why do we love spooky texts and horror? What is the appeal?
I think it's a bit different for everyone. I mean, it's such a broad genre. I should clarify that there are certain parts of horror I don't like. The really sort of violent, gory sort of stuff I'm not that into. Slasher films and things, I can't really do them, but I do love the more classic Victorian style ghost stories or werewolf sort of stuff, the supernatural, those sort of things. And for me, it's the weird, the what's in the darkness, the dark side of human nature, all of those sorts of things that I'm intrigued by. Do either of you enjoy more sort of gory sort of horror?
No, I can't do gory horror. I'm such a wuss. I can actually do lots of gore in text, or in a podcast form, but I can't do movies, TV. Stranger Things is about as scary as I get on TV. And that's not that scary.
No.
What about you, Jimmy?
I used to be able to do quite a lot of gore as an adolescent, and then something happened when I was about 20 or 21. I think my friend and I both binged on horror, literally binged. We went to a 1 month horror fest where we watched horror film after horror film after horror film after horror film.
Wow.
And the last one I remember, which for some reason it's an odd one to break me, but that one broke me. It was The Cell. I don't know whether you guys saw it with
No.
Jennifer. A ridiculous film. Jennifer Lopez is in it, and she appears at the end as the Virgin Mary. It's just so ridiculous. But for some reason, that film just broke me, and after that, I couldn't do gore anymore. And to this day, I still can't really do gore. But there's still a side of me that's fascinated by it. So I'll read up on gore and, as in real life stuff, serial killers in particular. I'm fascinated by serial killers. But afterwards, I get this horrible sense that the world is dark and awful, and I feel like I need to take a long shower to scrub myself completely clean afterwards. So it has a really unusual effect on me now, whereas in the past, it used to really fascinate me, and I used to be I loved it.
Yeah.
And now I actually can't imagine myself back then that really loved that aspect of it anymore, because now I look at it and I'm like, oh, dear God, Or maybe the gore is different now to what it was when I was younger, because it's so realistic now.
Yeah,
whereas
maybe.
I guess, when I was watching it back in the 80s and 90s, how depressing. It seemed realistic back then, but when you look at it now, it looks so dated and, so artificial and stylistic. Whereas now it's kind of you're seeing bones and cartilage and muscles and sinews and all that stuff. And I'm like, oh, God, no. Back then it was just red liquid.
I think that's...
I sort of skew...
Sorry, you go.
I sort of skew more in the Victorian ghost stories, like Kirstin. Sorry, Kirstin, I interrupted you.
No, you go ahead.
I like that kind of idea that there's something lurking in the dark and not quite knowing what's going on, and the creepy and the sinister, but never figuring out why. So that's more my sort of speed.
Yeah, I think that we're sort of teetering on the difference between the traditional Gothic definition between terror and horror here, I think. And it's that the terror is that hesitation that it could be real, the sort of supernatural, the ghosts, the werewolves, the creepiness in the dark. It could be real, but it's not in your face in the way that horror is, in terms of gore and murder and, all of this kind of stuff that Jimmy was mentioning about, special effects these days are so confronting, so in your face, and I think we're kind of desensitized, whether it's by even just what we see in the news. It's like a horror film these days. And so I think it kind of takes on a different meaning. You don't have that fantastic kind of separation from what you're watching anymore. It's very real, which makes it slightly different experience, I think.
Yeah, there's also an extreme movement that happened, I think, about 8 or 7 years ago, pioneered by, I think, a lot of international horror films, where they were actually just pushing the boundaries of what we can do with horror in terms of from a visceral sense. So there were films like High Tension or Haute Tension, the French title, and then there's all those Korean and Chinese ones. And I've watched a few of those, and they're just awful. Like, I suppose they're well made, but they reveal a very, very nihilistic view of humanity that just, nothing really makes sense anymore in this particular world. And at the same time, it sort of almost fetishizes violence and gore. The one that I'm thinking of in particular, which I didn't even watch because the trailer alone just had me nearly vomiting non-stop, was The Human Centipede.
Oh, yeah.
It wasn't that it was just so terrible. And then, horror for horror, one of my students told me that was his favourite film, and I went, oh wow. That's it.
That's a bit of a red flag.
But, I suppose, maybe we're now different generations in terms of the way we view horror.
Yeah.
Certainly the two of you sort of look back to the Victorian period for that sense of horror.
Yeah.
Whereas I look more towards, I guess, my childhood and my adolescence. So I was reading a lot of Christopher Pike, for example, when I was a teenager, and loving those sort of novels. I never got into Stephen King for whatever reason. I tried so many of his books and just couldn't get into him. But Christopher Pike I loved, and Dean Koontz I loved. And incidentally, I actually had a chance to revisit Christopher Pike when I was in New Zealand recently. And I reread one of his books, and I thought, wow, this is warped. Like, it was so... Have either you read Christopher Pike?
No, I've never read Christopher.
No? Oh, okay. It's a shame. Because his wasn't really conventional horror. It'll start off sometimes with very conventional stuff, and then he'll go into the weird and bizarre. I can't remember which one it was, but one of them somehow ended up in Mars. Like, I have no idea how that happened, and I still can't remember how it is, but I remember somehow we ended up in Mars, and I thought, this is just bizarre. Like, it actually went to the macabre, I guess.
Yeah.
And maybe that's what I loved about it. It took my imagination to a completely different area, whereas R.L. Stine, who was really popular...
Goosebumps.
Yeah, Goosebumps. Oh, so you guys know R.L. Stine, but not Christopher Pike.
Goosebumps.
And Stephen King, maybe they were more conventional horrors, whereas Christopher Pike was just... Sometimes he did conventional horrors, but sometimes he did just really wacky, bizarre ones that would incorporate sometimes Eastern mythology, other times science fiction. He would just go wherever, and they're really odd. And I guess that's what I loved about that sort of horror, and maybe, that sort of spooky idea that you were talking about, Stephanie.
Kirsten, what are some of your favourite spooky stories?
Well, I mean, all the traditional Victorian ghost stories. I love all of them. But yeah, pretty much anything that harkens back to that era and contains ghosts and the supernatural. But I love also, I've always been drawn, apparently since I was about 2 years old, to werewolves. For some reason.
Werewolves? Yes. What is the appeal of the werewolf?
For me, it was the wildness of for me, it was the wolf part of the werewolf. I just loved...
You're a dog fan, aren't you?
A what fan?
You love dogs, don't you? Because we did have an appearance from what's his name, Rocco.
Oh, Coco. Yeah. I've told her she's not allowed to participate in this podcast. But yeah, she did have some opinions to offer on werewolves, being canine herself. But yeah. But yeah, it was the wolf side for me, and I think that is part of the appeal of werewolves. It's that the animality, the human-animal divide, the fact that the werewolf, I mean, in its name, the werewolf is neither completely animal or completely human. We get to kind of explore the beastly side of humanity and the human side of animals, and it's kind of a really nice way to explore both what we admire, like, a pack animal like a wolf. We admire the loyalty, for example. It's one of the most common themes in werewolf, modern werewolf fiction. But we're terrified of the hunting and the killing, the stalking, the glowing eyes. There's just so much iconography there that we can draw on that's steeped in the scariness, the sort of beasts that lurk in the shadows.
So what are some of your favourite werewolf texts?
I've always liked, going back to sort of folklore and fairy tales, obviously Red Riding Hood is one of the most common, well-known examples of a wolf. So that's enjoyable. But I really love the way that film has created, really, our image of werewolves. They're obviously the original Wolfman. It's not the earliest werewolf film, but it's one of the most popular in 1941. It's recently remade in the last few years, but the original was obviously responsible for catapulting the werewolf into the popular lexicon of those horror creatures. And since then, I've really enjoyed watching the remake, the TV series Teen Wolf.
I knew that was coming up.
Yes, I've talked to you about this before. I've tried to convince you to watch it. It's aimed at it's teen, it's young adult television, so it's aimed at a teen audience. I think the protagonist is 16 when the series starts, and they do look quite young. But I just really enjoy it. It's quite popular, which fascinates me. So that the sort of teen culture is really into this gothic right now, this sort of gothic horror. It is a remake of the Michael J. Fox Teen Wolf, but it pretty much diverts immediately. It uses the same character name, the same concept of a teenager turning into a wolf, but it does it in such a dark way. It returns it to its sort of folkloric gothic dark roots. There's a lot of blood, a lot of scary moments, a lot of horror, but it's from a supernatural angle, so I can handle it. It's okay.
Why do you think teens are into wolves?
Well, for one,
is it Twilight?
Well, oh god, I hope not.
No, not Kirstin, but other people.
Yeah, I think wolves have always been a bit sexy. They are, especially when we're dealing with puberty, with masculinity through the wolf, and it's just, yeah, it gives, the Teen Wolf particularly loves its scenes where the boys have to take their shirts off before they turn into a wolf. And
so does Kirstin.
So does Kirstin, yes.
Well, yeah, not so much the younger characters, but there are some older ones that I don't mind so much. I think it's that animalistic side. It's pushing the boundaries. It's very much about transgression.
Buffy did that as well with Oz, didn't it?
Absolutely. And in fact, Teen Wolf is very heavily inspired. The producers acknowledge being very heavily inspired by the whole show, Buffy. And so perhaps that's why I enjoy it. There is a lot of crossover.
I've got to watch it. It's on my Netflix queue.
Yeah, good.
Actually, it's funny that you should say about why teens love werewolves so much, because my memory of the original 80s version of Teen Wolf, the film, is that it was about, in a way, it's an allegory for adolescence, or that transition from childhood to manhood.
Yeah.
And it was played as a comedy. I don't think there was a lot of horror.
No, it's really
the film.
camp
it's hysterical.
And goofy.
It's funny. Yeah.
Yeah, whereas this seems to take it probably more seriously and has taken a different approach to the same story. But yeah, I guess I never really sort of saw it from that perspective, that the wolf of the animal could be seen as that move from childhood through adolescence and then through to manhood again. That's quite an interesting comparison to make right there. I was thinking more along the line of that horror film that scarred me for life as a kid, which was an American Werewolf in London.
Yeah.
And you are in London right now, Kirstin, so you can relate.
She's looking.
She's looking. But that one was... I don't know why I was watching that as a kid, but I remember being really terrified of that particular film.
But that's what's fun about watching horror films. When I remember being at sleepovers with my friends, and we would put horror movies on, and somebody would like knock on somebody else's shoulder halfway through when you jump, and that was kind of fun. There's a thrill you get out of being scared.
Yeah.
There's a thrill you get out of being in the dark and knowing you're going to scare yourself but going along with it anyway. I think that's part of being a teenager.
Yeah, but I suppose, maybe this is maybe my experience, but have either of you experienced films or texts that have stayed with you as almost like a source of fear or anxiety?
Kirsten?
I think
I need to think.
I've tended, I need to think as well. I think I've tended to stay away from anything that I know is very scarring.
Well, I can give you my example. I mean, the one that still to this day, the image of it, for whatever reason, terrifies me. And this was, I think I was 8 when I saw this, Nightmare on Elm Street.
Oh, yeah.
And it was one scene in particular, and it was when, what's her name? I think it was Nancy, appears in broad daylight, wrapped in plastic and all bloodied, in front of someone's hallucination or something like that. And that image has stayed with me for up till now. And for whatever reason, that image really just terrifies me. Maybe it's something about we associate horror or fear with darkness, and having that in broad daylight was just such a terrifying concept to me that, even during the daytime, you can't run away from some of these ideas.
Yeah.
Did either of you have any of those?
I don't think it was a particular text. I know that I enjoyed that feeling of being frightened. There wasn't a kind of image that stayed in my mind. I've had a long-standing fear of movies that feature beheading, but I don't think that's quite what you're looking for. But the kind of texts that stand out for me are the kind of creepy ones where you don't quite know what's happening. Like, I really like Shirley Jackson. Shirley Jackson is read very widely in America, but is almost never read here. And her 2 novels, The Haunting of Hill House and We've Always Lived in the Castle, are the kinds of texts that kind of stay with me. It's not quite ever clear in her novels what's actually happening. Is this, in The Haunting of Hill House, you never really kind of figure out exactly what's going on. And We've Always Lived in the Castle is about, human terror. Like, it's less about the supernatural and more about the terrible things people do to each other. But because there's so many kind of questions and it's all very ambiguous and it's all about terrible things happening in, big houses where they're dark and they've got lots of corners, that kind of stayed with me more. The Haunting of Hill House is the book that's behind the movie The Haunting.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of stuff that I always have been drawn to more than the kind of slasher stuff.
Incidentally, that was one of the films that I watched during that binge. Because that was exactly.
So read Shirley Jackson.
Yeah, I think it's the same for me. I think Shirley Jackson's, particularly with The Haunting on Hill House, really picks up on that Victorian Gothic that we were talking about with the ghostly, particularly as you mentioned the house. It's the use of space. It's the invisible, but kind of that liminal space. You've got corridors, doors, stairs going up, doors closing, opening, you're moving between spaces, and there's always, as you move through, this sense of space beyond what you can see. And so it kind of goes hand in hand with the supernatural. There are invisible things around us, they're right there, but you can't see them, and I think that's terrifying. So any text for me...
And that's kind of the classic Gothic trope, those haunted houses or the houses in which bad things happen is there right from the beginning of the Gothic. It's like this standard Gothic trope that we keep coming back to because it is terrifying. Turn out all the lights in your house and hang around by yourself for a while and you can talk yourself into being scared.
Absolutely. I just had an article come out on Horace Walpole and the Castle of Otranto. That's obviously the first Gothic novel, and the relationship between that and his house that he built, Strawberry Hill. And I look at the way that the space in that house kind of creates just what I said there, that sense of liminal space, space beyond, and that sense that you're moving through different dimensions of space, and you've got the natural and the supernatural kind of merging together. And the house, obviously, according to him, his own sort of legend that he created, he had a dream or a nightmare based on the stairwell in that house, which is, I think, the most beautiful part. You kind of got this shadow underneath. It's absolutely amazing to walk into. This spiraling staircase that goes upwards into the light, and you've got these doors leading off as you go up the staircase. And it's really just that quintessential sort of Gothic, intertwined, layered space. And so that staircase appeared in his dream and inspired the novel. And so right from the beginning, we've got this architecture playing a huge part in the Gothic. And I love the way that that's That's still even used even in things like Teen Wolf with the urban settings. You move from the forest, which is the same thing. The trees kind of block vision, and usually they've got that iconic image of trees lit from behind by the moonlight shining through mist, and then you see a silhouette wolf figure move out from behind one of the trees. You know, that's one of the most iconic sort of horror images. But alongside that, there's a lot of use of urban space, and again, it's that obscuring your vision so that you know that there could be something behind that wall or just around that corner that's about to jump out and get you.
And I think because it's also tied to the domestic space, that's even scarier. You know, that idea that something could be lurking in your home.
Exactly.
That there is this kind of liminal space that's just around the corner of what is otherwise a kind of mundane domestic setting. I think that makes it a little bit scarier as well, that idea that you can't trust the place where you should be able to feel comfortable.
Absolutely.
That's a really kind of scary idea.
Definitely. I think, again, that to go back to what's appealing about the werewolf, I think any of those monsters that morph back into the human, when in the daylight, you could be talking to them or they could be living in the house with you and you don't know who the monster is. A bit of a Jekyll and Hyde sort of trope there.
Has the vampire gone out of popularity at the moment? Like, is it the werewolf? That's the kind of monster du jour.
I'm told it's the mermaid.
The mermaid?
Apparently mermaids are going to be the next big thing.
Yeah.
I don't know why, but... And I can sort of see it happening. There's more and more mermaid things coming out. I don't know what's going to be scary about mermaids, though. But
because they lure men to their deaths.
That's sirens.
Yeah, but that's sort of related. It's close enough. Come on. But like, what? Unless
zombies are the big thing. At the
moment. Unless mermaids have that association with death, what's scary about them?
Oh, there he is. Oh, she is. Sorry, Coco.
I know.
Sorry?
She's just insistent that she had something to say. I could translate.
The werewolves.
She's saying, look, go back to the werewolves. They are very popular right now. Coco really enjoys them.
We don't care about mermaids.
Exactly. Well, enough of the fish.
Who cares about fish?
I can't remember the film now, but there was a film that came out, I think, about 2 years ago, and I think it was a foreign film about a killer mermaid.
That's bizarre.
Yeah, but I think she does target men or something to that effect. I can't remember now.
Yeah, but, well, as you would expect.
That's fine. But maybe what it is it's a response to the masculine monster, which is the werewolves. Mermaids tend to be more feminine monsters. So, and we haven't really had an exclusively feminine monster. Most monsters tend to be masculine. So maybe it's Medusa, but she never really took over as a sort of a trend or
that's true.
A fad. And if mermaids are taking over, maybe it's women power now coming in to say we're reclaiming the monsters.
We can be serial killers too.
Oh, don't talk about that. I just listened to a podcast on Catherine Knight that I think will haunt me for years and years to come.
We can talk about horror podcasts later because I have a lot of opinions on it. But is the era of the vampire over? Is it zombies?
Oh, zombies!
Is it werewolves?
Zombies are huge right now, and there's a move towards normalizing the monster as well. You've got things like the TV show iZombie, which is about a zombie trying to just basically live her life, her undead sort of life. You know, I think vampires are I think they're always going to be popular. I don't think we've seen the end of the vampire quite yet, although we have been heavily saturated in the last few years. So yeah, perhaps we are moving towards other creatures like the mermaid. But obviously one particularly stereotypically female monster is the witch.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, and so obviously things like the Blair Witch, it obviously very problematic things like the witch in terms of gender and things like that, but also a lot of potential for horror and very, very terrifying sort of stuff. And the occult is kind of woven through a lot of the other beasts anyway. Werewolves and vampires tend to be sort of associated with the occult, with magic, witches somehow at some point.
Yeah. I like this. I like stories about the witch because it's It's a way of, I mean, yes, it can kind of venture into really uncomfortable gender territory in that historically we know that women who were, marginalised were often accused of being witches, old women with kind of traditional knowledge and stuff like that. But I love stories about witches because I kind of feel like it's women's chance to get revenge, that they've been on the sidelines for so long, and I just like to see a woman behaving badly. I find that really kind of... affirming in a bizarre way.
Well, that's very much aligned with one of the original witch character, which is Medea.
Yeah,
so,
I love Medea.
Exactly.
She's great. Yeah.
But I think the horror film of the year, or as voted by critics last year, was one called Witch.
Yeah, I never saw that.
Yeah, but apparently that's more about sort of the devil or devil worshipping, which I suppose witchcraft is linked to as well. But that's a horror trope that never seems to fade with time. The idea of devils or exorcism, that's
absolutely
always ongoing and continuous to some degree.
Well, these are all ways of like people trying to make sense of the world. Like it made sense to kind of say, oh, if death had visited a village and you didn't really know why, you would to turn and point your finger at somebody who seemed odd and strange. And I think that even though the Enlightenment has happened and science has happened, there are still a lot of things we don't understand, and we attempt to explain, and we reach for explanations still that are outlandish or mired in some kind of vestige of a supernatural belief. Yeah,
I think some people use that to explain the rise or the popularity of the vampire, because apparently during the 18th and 19th century, when consumption, or what we know now as tuberculosis, was on the rise, people said, well, it's a vampiric act, so these people were wasting away because they were being drained of their lives by vampires.
Yeah.
Of course, we now know that's not the case, but the supernatural has always been a way for us to explain what we don't know. And I think it's interesting then that we start to normalise or sometimes even romanticise the supernatural in a way to be comfortable with some of these ideas. So the vampire now...
The romantic vampire.
Yeah, the romantic vampire. I mean, the vampire now, glitters in the sun like Robert Pattinson does. And, the zombie now can fall in love with a human and cure his own zombie-like behaviour.
Can somebody explain zombie romance to me? Because I do not understand how romance and zombie can go together.
Well, the only one I've seen that actually combined it surprisingly effectively is Warm Bodies. And I went into that film wanting to hate it and thinking it's going to be absolutely pathetic and terrible. And then, to my horror, halfway through the film, I realised I was enjoying it, and I was enjoying it because I figured out what was going on, which was it wasn't really a zombie film. It was a zombie film adaptation of Romeo and Juliet, with the zombie being Romeo, because his name is R, and because that's all he can say is a zombie, R. So there was a lot of really playful stuff like that. But the whole idea of it is that, and maybe it's an idea that's being explored by other texts too. The one I'm thinking of is I Am Legend, where the monster is actually just our own fear of the other.
Yeah.
So the zombie then becomes a manifestation of the other, and as people start to understand the zombie or the other, they actually start to relate to it. And likewise, the zombie starts to become more human. And that's exactly what happens in Warm Bodies. As he starts to fall in love with Julie, as she's known, he becomes more and more human. And in a way, he cures his own zombie. I mean, there's obviously a lot of problems with that. No, he doesn't.
Okay.
He does at the beginning of the film, but as he becomes more and more human, he stops eating brain.
Because that would be a real deal breaker in a relationship if your boyfriend ate brains.
Well, I think they do that with what's that Drew Barrymore one on Netflix? Santa
Clarita Diet.
Yeah,
that one. Because doesn't that play with that idea? Because she's a zombie and she's in some sort of relationship, isn't she? And certainly I know iZombie does that, except this is a detective zombie. So she does eat brain, but she eats brain to find out what happened to these victims, because she gets the last memory that they had.
That's very ecological.
Yeah, it is. She from memory, I think she's a surgeon who somehow during a cruise became infected with the zombie virus and became a zombie, but she doesn't want to be a malignant zombie, so she realised that she has a particular gift, which is that she consumes not only the brain but the memory of the corpse. And so she starts to consume the brains of victims of violent murders to find out what happened to them and to help solve the case.
So she's like a Dexter figure.
She is, very much so. But it's really bizarre. I mean, I only watched about 2 episodes. I liked it, but I just haven't had time to watch the rest. But I think in a way it is sort of normalising the monster. But at the same time, it's also doing what I love most, which is combining genres. So you've got the horror, the zombie genre being combined with the detective.
Absolutely.
That one. And with Warm Bodies, as you mentioned, you have the horror with the romance, which always has gone really well together, mind you. Horror and romance have always played particularly well. I'm thinking in particular of vampire myths, and I blame Anne Rice for that. But
I would blame Bram Stoker for that.
Yeah.
You think so? But I didn't really get romance element in Bram Stoker's text. I mean, adaptations of Bram Stoker.
There's a sexual element.
There is a sexual element to it, but I mean, Dracula, from memory, was described as quite a repulsive monster. I mean, he had hair on his palm and he smelled like rotten flesh.
But then you have like the vampire babes. There's 3 of them.
The wives of Dracula.
yeah, exactly. The vampire babes.
But wouldn't that come from an older tradition? What's that? Is it Camilla? Or?
Yeah, the
Camilla,
lesbian vampire.
The lesbian
stories.
vampire, yeah. So that would probably come from that tradition more than from the Bram Stoker tradition, possibly.
There's been stories about vampires that predate Bram Stoker by centuries, you know, and people burying, you know, people at the crossroads with stakes through them and all of this sort of stuff. It's all based on folk legend. But that's what the Gothic does, as Kirstin will know, because this is her area. It's all about, you know, hiving up all these old superstitions and supernatural kind of elements and blending them in a kind of modern mix. And that's why it's so brilliant, because it kind of taps into all of these old beliefs and all of these old fears.
Yeah, I think we kind of long for that, a more simple time. It's a way to kind of return to the pastoral in a way, where the world was more simple. There were villages, there was the woodlands just outside, and genuine beasts lurking in the forest, which are perhaps easier for us to understand than the horrors we have to endure these days in the modern world. You know, with the wars that go on and Trump as president, you know, how did that horror movie ever come about?
Yeah, maybe because we're living in a horror movie.
Yeah, I think it's nicer in some ways to look back to a time when things were more simple and the good and the evil were more easily separated. I think that's appealing for a lot of people as well.
And the idea that that evil can be destroyed. You know, you
exactly,
kill the werewolf or kill the vampire and it's gone.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Whereas now I think it's more complex, and the idea of horror is that it's, you know, around every corner and not vanquishable.
Yeah. I think again, that's another thing that I think is so appealing about the werewolf, particularly the way it's presented these days, and the vampire and the zombie and things like that, is that the idea that the horror is potentially within us. The beast is within us now. It's not something outside, but it's within ourselves. But we have the ability to learn how to control it and overcome it and return back to the human. And so I think that the theme in a lot of modern Gothic and horror, particularly the teen stuff, is about how to control those impulses and how to not be a horrible person, even though you might want to be.
And that comes from Buffy as well, doesn't it? Because that's whole like Angel's arc, you know, the beast within, you know. Every time I hang out with Kirstin, we talk about Buffy, but it is sort of so central to Buffy, that idea that we all have a kind of wellspring of evil or at least potential to behave in ways that aren't great, and we have to kind of learn to control them.
Yeah. Definitely. That idea as well of to what extent are we controlled by other people? So a lot of these supernatural shifts, these morphs into other creatures, whether it's a werewolf or something else, the werewolf is traditionally controlled by the moon, and it's a painful transition from human to wolf form. It's something that you don't necessarily want to do of your own accord. It's something that controls you, and then when you're in the wolf form, the human disappears. And I guess the question is, at what point in the transition does the human disappear and the beast come out? Where do we lose ourselves? And so the modern stuff really explores that boundary. The whole arc of the Teen Wolf series is really Scott McCall learning to control that. And he actually spends a lot of time in that liminal space between wolf and human, because he learns how to control it and use it to sort of achieve human goals and human ends, and resist the wolf, but also use it to empower his own ideas of what should and shouldn't be done. So I think that's a really interesting modern use of the other, the scary beast, in a positive way. In this way, it sort of explores nice ideas, I think, nice constructions of healthy masculinity and friendship and identity and things like that. So that's an interesting way of using something scary in a positive way.
Well, that's interesting too, because the werewolf is kind of the figure par excellence of uncontrolled masculinity, uncontrolled kind of savage masculinity. So It's interesting that they're using that as a way of kind of working through that to a kind of more healthy understanding of what masculinity is. Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, the original ones, the wolves are out of control. They kill people, even though the original, the wolf man might be a really moral, nice guy in the daylight, but when he's a wolf, he kills indiscriminately. And it's that sort of switch from man to beast. Whereas, I actually really like, I think I've always, as I said, ever since I was little, I kind of sympathised with the werewolf, and I was really drawn to them. I don't know why, if they were sort of more killer-like back then. But I think that's what draws me to these kind of representations now in things like Teen Wolf and other ones, is because it's becoming easier to empathise with that supernatural creature, with that liminal being, or, on the edge of the supernatural world, trying to be human, trying to fit in. I think it's really interesting the way they do that.
I think that too, there's also an appeal of being scared in a kind of safe and controlled environment, because one of my favourite things to do is listen to horror podcasts. And I often listen to horror podcasts when I'm walking. So I put my earphones on. I do find that scary, but it's kind of controlled scary. So I just go for a walk around my neighbourhood and I listen to horror podcasts and I get scared and creeped out. But it's kind of fun to be scared and creeped out in that kind of environment. I really it's a kind of fear that you can manage.
Well, yeah. I don't know whether you can manage it, because, a lot of stories I've read are usually people who go for walks and then they get abducted. So if I was listening
I'm not getting abducted. This is like at 10 a.m.
I know, but when you talk about walking and then putting on your headphones and listening to podcasts, that's the first thing I thought of. I thought, oh my God, abduction. I promise
you I'm not getting abducted.
I'm not quite sure it's safe. For me, a safe space would be in my car, driving home and listening to horror podcasts, which I... maybe not so much horror podcasts. I listen more to serial killer podcasts, which does have my house very, very disturbed and very worried.
Jimmy, in the car.
What about the black tapes?
What about the horror, the murderer leaping up from the back seat and slitting your throat?
Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
Oh, that old wives' tale.
The
urban legend.
I check the back seat of my car all the time.
Me too.
Well, my car's very small, so it's pretty hard to hide.
So is mine.
I'm pretty sure it doesn't quite happen that way. But no, I actually do prefer to listen to it at night time when I'm driving back. So there's that extra sense of creepiness.
Well, see, I'm listening
that's what I'm relating to.
It's sunny and bright, and I'm listening to some horror. Yeah,
what did I just tell you about Nightmare on Elm Street? Even in broad daylight, horror can occur. I did try to listen to a few of those horror podcasts that you mentioned. So
Black Tapes podcast, my absolute favourite.
Yes, I have something to say about Black Tapes. I recommended it to a few friends, and I didn't tell them deliberately that it was fictional. Yeah. So they listened to this thing and they were getting really into it, and they're like, "Oh my God, this is so creepy and interesting." And then about halfway through, it finally clicked, and they were like, "This isn't real, is it?" And I was like, "No." And then they stopped listening to it because they became so disillusioned by the fact that it's not real.
Oh.
Because,
of course it's fictional.
Well, it sells itself as not fictional initially. And,
that's true.
And I think in the first 2 or 3 episodes, there was a believability about it.
Yeah, that's true.
And then it starts to get a little bit,
So for those who haven't listened to the Black Tapes, I don't know, Kirstin, if you've listened to it.
No.
Yeah. It sells itself as a kind of... serial investigation into these black tapes, which are unexplained supernatural events.
I call it Serial Meets X-Files.
It is a bit Serial Meets X-Files, and it's becoming a little bit convoluted now. I have to kind of spend a moment remembering who everybody is and how everybody's connected. But it really hinges on this idea of the unsound, which is this sound that you hear, and when you hear it, you end up dead within a year. I do have a T-shirt that says "I survived the unsound." But it's working on that kind of fear of that you've touched something or done something or stumbled somewhere or heard something that you shouldn't have heard, and now that you have, you're cursed, or it's impossible to kind of elude. And for some reason, that really appeals to me. I'm also listening to another one at the moment called Small Town Horror, which is really great. And there's a new one that has just been put out by the team that does Snap Judgment, and that's called Spooked, and it's just ghost stories.
I have listened to that.
It's so much fun.
Yeah, that one I do enjoy, but I have friends who can't listen to it because they get too creeped out by it.
Creeped out is fun.
Well, I think maybe, I'm at the age now where most of my friends don't really like to be scared anymore. They just want, happy, nice things, and they don't really want to see the darker side of humanities. For whatever reason, I'm still fascinated by the darker side. So my go-to podcast at the moment is Case File.
Yeah.
I'm absolutely addicted to it, and it's a terrible thing to be addicted to because I'm listening to pretty much the worst of humanity at the moment, and some of these stories are absolutely horrific. But I love the caption of of the entire podcast, which is that what do they say? Reality is scarier than fiction, or real life is scarier than fiction. And I think there is some sort of truth to that, and maybe this is what you two are talking about when you're talking about the spooky or the supernatural. This is a contained or a acceptable scariness, whereas reality is almost it is an unacceptable scariness because if you're at the receiving end of that, you don't survive.
Yeah,
and it's one of the worst horrors, I suppose, you can imaginable in that sense.
I think for me the only way I devour these sort of happier, supernatural, scary, manageable Victorian Gothic sort of stuff, daily. But the only way I can watch genuinely scary or horror sort of films for me is with a group of friends, because I enjoy that feeling. I have to have my back like against the couch or against the wall, so there's nothing behind me. And I kind of, it's almost mimics that sitting around the campfire and sharing scary stories. Whenever I've gone camping, we always tell ghost stories around the fire. And when I was tiny, when we used to stay over at my grandparents' house, who were both marvelous storytellers, we'd sit around their fire or climb into their bed and we'd all listen gleefully as my grandma in particular would tell the most scary werewolf stories, usually set in Hungary. Pun intended, I think. And it was just so wonderful, so spooky, and she would sort of, at the really scary moment, she would pounce on us and scare us and grab us, and it was wonderfully, gleefully scary. And I think watching films with friends where if someone screams, everyone screams and jumps, that adds to that atmosphere, and it's a fun way to digest what is otherwise too terrifying for me, because my imagination runs away with it. And I just, like you said, Jimmy, at the beginning, if I've watched something too horrible, too gory and awful, particularly when it's a human who's perpetrating the evil, the rest of the week is tainted for me. The sunlight feels dirty. Everything just feels gross, which is why I tend not to do it. I don't watch anything like that anymore. But yeah, with friends, I think it's a safer environment, and it's fun that way.
Yeah, I agree. I find that kind of creepiness really fun. That's why I kind of seek out these kinds of, scary stories and scary podcasts and scary TV shows that aren't too gory, because it is fun. It's a controlled way of being scared. It makes the kind of darkness, it makes that kind of evil underside of the world manageable, fun, and safe. I'm not, when I'm reading ghost stories, I'm getting really into it and, that feeling that fear and all of that. But I don't believe that a ghost is going to come and kill me, Whereas if I'm reading about a serial killer or experiencing something about a serial killer who is a human, then, that is something that is a real fear and it could actually happen. Whereas with the supernatural, as much as I love reading about it, I don't believe a word of it. So it's fine.
Yeah. I remember being, I think it was year 7. I was 12 going on 13, and it was Halloween, and I had some friends over, and my sisters and my friends and I all sat down and we watched Scream and then I Know What You Did Last Summer. And I wasn't accustomed
Classics.
to horror movies at that stage, not to that extent, like proper slasher films. And I remember it was so much fun while we were watching them, and then we all went and walked around the streets afterwards, scaring each other and things like that. But then when I went to bed that night, I didn't sleep a wink. I sat there with my back against the wall on my bed, staring at my door and then at my cupboard door, and kind of judging which one was the killer going to come out of, because I was sure it was going to happen. And I haven't watched many of those slasher films since that moment, I think.
Well, I kind of like those old slasher, like the ones in the 90s, because they were really kind of self-aware, metatextual kind of meditations on the slasher film. And so I therefore kind of, I must confess, I still was scared watching Scream, and I know what you did last summer, but I could also kind of enjoy the humour that was baked into those in a way that I don't feel like I could enjoy more contemporary horror that seems to be more straight horror than that kind of very sly, aware horror that was being done in the 90s around the teen kind of slasher film. Because Scream is just taking off the slasher film. And so I could enjoy that aspect of it, even though I still remember scenes, actually. Maybe this goes to your, like, earlier question, Jimmy, of scenes that you find scary. I think that there was a murder that happened in a movie theatre in one of the Scream movies.
Second one, yeah.
Yeah, and I still, that movie theatre, oh, yuck.
It didn't involve decapitation,
It didn't involve decapitation, but it was bad enough as it is. Before we go, we only have like a minute to go, but can we talk about how great M.R. James is? Have either of you read M.R. James?
Yeah.
No.
I'm sure Kirstin has.
Yes, well, there you go.
Yeah.
Kirstin, are you an M.R. James fan?
Yes, I am.
He's like the epitome of that, like, Victorian ghost story. It's always about, some very kind of literate person not believing in ghosts, but then finding out that, oh, actually, this can't be explained through kind of rational means.
Yeah.
And for some reason, it just really works for me.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of the appeal of that, particularly that sort of late Victorian, early 20th century stuff, is it moves right into psychological territory. It's very much, is this real, is this not? If it can't, can it be explained or not? And that's partly where the terror lies, in sort of identifying with a protagonist that is resisting this stuff, but it keeps happening anyway. Yeah, it's very different from sort of trying to identify with someone that already implicitly believes everything that's going on. It's much easier, I think, to sort of come into it with a protagonist that's resisting, and it makes it scarier when there aren't easy explanations.
Even because the protagonists themselves is sort of the audience stand-in because they don't believe it, and even the point where even they believe it is the kind of point where you go, oh God,
Yeah.
That's the kind of scary tipping point. So M.R. James for me has always been a kind of Halloween classic.
Yes.
I think we've completely run out of time. Thank you so much, Kirstin, for dialing in from the UK. Say hello to your dog for me.
Thank you very much for having me again. It's been so much fun.
We always love having Kirstin, and thank you to Jimmy as well.
Always a pleasure.
So we hope you guys have a great Halloween and you don't get too scared. I kind of also resent Halloween because it's at the wrong time of year for us here in Australia, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to read some scary stories and enjoy the kind of scary atmosphere in a kind of safe, controlled way. And I would try to avoid getting abducted on my horror walks.
Please do.
Yeah, I will. Thank you guys once again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And this has been another episode of From the Lighthouse. If you could please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, that would be really, really helpful in helping other people find the show. If you wanted to tell us about your favourite stories, you can find us at Twitter at MQ English, or you can always drop us a line through Apple Podcasts or through our website at fromthelighthouse.org. We'll see you again in 1 week. Bye.